The night air over North Africa carried the dry scent of oil, sand, and something else, an unease that only men who had seen machines die mid-air could understand. The desert wind whispered against the corrugated metal of the hangars, a low moan that seemed almost human in its fatigue. Somewhere in the blackness beyond the floodlights, a plane coughed, sputtered, and went silent. For Sergeant Alan Pierce, it was the sound of a nightmare returning, one that had already cost lives and which no one else seemed able to stop. It was February 17, 1943, 02:13 hours, at an RAF forward base near El Jem, Tunisia. The ground was cracked and cold, a thin layer of dust blowing over scattered shell casings and discarded tools. Pierce sat alone beside a half-disassembled Bristol Beaufighter, his grease-stained fingers trembling slightly from a mix of exhaustion and anger. He hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. His uniform smelled of fuel, his skin of sweat and burnt metal. In his lap lay a small, warped component, an oil line coupling no thicker than his thumb. To most, it was just another replaceable part. To Pierce, it was a murderer. Over the past week, 3 aircraft from the 225 Squadron had gone down under the same mysterious conditions. Engines seizing mid-flight, controls locking up, and then a silent descent into flame and dust. The pilots were veterans, not prone to error. Lieutenant Harris, age 26, from Devonshire, had radioed in seconds before impact. His voice cracked with disbelief. "She's freezing up again. God, not again." The words had cut through the static and lodged themselves somewhere deep in Pierce's chest. He had known Harris, had shared cigarettes with him by the fuel drums, had laughed at his jokes about the bloody British way of making war look civilized. Now, there was just silence where that laughter used to be. Command blamed the climate. Others blamed bad luck. Pierce blamed the mechanics, themselves in a way, but more specifically a design flaw. He'd noticed the oil coolers on the Beaufighters choking with desert dust, clogging their narrow fins until the pressure spiked. But his theory was brushed off as field imagination. The manual said the system worked perfectly, and in London, perhaps it did. In the Sahara, perfection was a myth that burned alive with the first sunrise. He leaned against the wing, eyes tracing the pockmarks on its surface. He thought of his father, a machinist back in Bristol, who used to say, "If it keeps breaking the same way, you're fixing the wrong thing." Those words echoed now, louder than the generator's hum, louder than the crickets outside. So Pierce decided, at that hour between fatigue and madness, to do something that would have him court-martialed if discovered. He took apart the oil system, every line, every fitting, every bracket. The mechanics who shared his tent would have thought him mad if they saw the chaos laid out in front of him. He worked with a kind of desperate calm, using tools so worn their grips had turned to smooth metal. When the crescent wrench slipped and sliced his palm, he didn't even curse. He just watched the blood drip into the dust and thought, "There's more of that in the sky right now." By dawn, his hands were trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around him, the sand glowed orange beneath the rising sun, and in the hangar light, the Beaufighter's frame looked skeletal, half machine, half corpse. He stared at the oil cooler and saw what no one else had wanted to see. The fins were too dense, too narrow, designed for humid climates where heat was the enemy, not dust. Here, in the desert, the design turned suicidal. He scavenged parts from wrecks scattered beyond the airfield, bent aluminum, sections of tubing, even a dented canteen. With these, he began shaping what he called, half in jest, his stupid filter. Boop. It was crude, a mesh barrier made from the metal screens of fuel strainers, wrapped around the intake with wire and sealed using the canvas from an old parachute harness. Its purpose was simple: keep the sand out before it could choke the cooler. The risk, though, was that it might also restrict airflow and overheat the engine faster than before. When his crew chief, Corporal Nash, walked in and saw what he was doing, he laughed bitterly. "That's suicide, Al. You'll blow the whole bloody motor." "Maybe," Pierce said quietly, "but at least I'll know which kind of death it prefers." He installed the prototype on a single Beaufighter, the one assigned to Lieutenant Martin Doyle, a quiet Irishman with a steady hand and the sort of eyes that never quite smiled. Doyle trusted Pierce. He'd seen him fix the unfixable more than once. When Pierce explained the modification, Doyle only nodded once and said, "If it buys me one more mission, that's enough." The test flight was set for dusk. The airfield fell silent as the Beaufighter's engines roared to life, deep and guttural. Pierce stood by the tarmac, every muscle taut, watching as the twin props blurred into silver halos. The plane rolled forward, gathering speed, then lifted gracefully into the desert twilight. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then came the radio crackle, temperature holding steady, oil pressure normal, climbing to 5,000 feet. Pierce exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Then the voice came again, almost incredulous. "She's running smoother than she ever did, Alan. Whatever you did, don't change a damn thing." When Doyle landed, the mechanics surrounded the aircraft. The oil lines were spotless, the filters intact, and the temperature readings perfect. Against every rule, every warning, Pierce's stupid idea had worked. Over the next week, he quietly modified the rest of the squadron's aircraft. He did it in silence, often alone, because official approval never came. Command still didn't believe in the problem, but the crashes stopped. The engines ran cleaner, cooler, and stronger. Pilots started returning from missions without that haunted look of men waiting for a mechanical failure to kill them. Then one night, 2 intelligence officers arrived from Cairo. They wanted to inspect the unauthorized alterations reported by a supply sergeant. Pierce's career should have ended right there. But instead of reprimand, something else happened. The next morning, those same officers requested a full technical report. Within weeks, the design, refined and officially sanctioned, spread across North African squadrons. The desert claimed enough lives as it was. Thanks to one man's defiance, it would claim fewer. Still, recognition never came. The filter was later credited to a design bureau in Birmingham, whose engineers had never set foot in Africa. Pierce's name didn't appear in any reports. When he was transferred to Italy in '44, he left behind a stack of field notes and the remains of his prototype rusting under the desert sun. But among the pilots, the legend endured. They spoke of Pierce's fix in hushed tones, passing the story down through maintenance crews who understood what it meant to care more about lives than regulations. And somewhere, amid the wreckage of old hangars and sand-filled craters, there remains a trace of the man who turned desperation into innovation, whose stupid idea saved an entire squadron from disaster. The war had moved on, but Alan Pierce's name stayed behind, buried somewhere in the fine print of forgotten dispatches and unsigned engineering memos. By the time the Allies pushed through Sicily and into the Italian mainland, the stupid filter had become standard issue across dozens of maintenance units. No one called it that anymore, of course. It was now officially designated the Type C pre-intake mesh assembly, and the technical documents credited its design to a committee of engineers under the Ministry of Aircraft Production. But the men who installed it, the mechanics with blackened hands and sleepless eyes, still whispered that it came from one of their own. It was late September 1943 when Pierce arrived at the muddy airfield near Foggia, Italy, part of the newly established No. 255 Squadron. The desert sun was gone, replaced by cold rains that turned everything into sludge. The hangars were makeshift and damp, smelling of wet earth and kerosene. The planes were newer now, mosquitoes, sleek and fast. But their problems were no less deadly. Engines flooded in the rain, controls jammed with ice, and supply lines barely kept up with the constant tempo of sorties. Pierce had grown thinner, his face sharpened by fatigue and years of makeshift living. His hands shook sometimes when he lit his cigarettes, not from fear, but from a kind of permanent vibration left by endless nights of engine noise and adrenaline. He was 31, but he looked 50. On his second night at Foggia, the squadron lost another pilot. Flight Lieutenant Gerald Cook, 24, from Manchester, had taken off in a routine night patrol. He never came back. Wreckage was found 2 days later at the base of a ravine, twisted aluminum gleaming faintly in the drizzle. Pierce went with the recovery crew. What he saw chilled him. The propeller blades showed no sign of rotation at impact. Another power failure. Another preventable death, maybe. The post-crash inspection revealed the culprit. Moisture had seeped into the magneto housings, shorting the ignition during a sudden temperature drop. It was a known problem, but the standard covers issued by supply were ineffective in heavy rain. Most mechanics shrugged it off as inevitable in combat conditions. But Pierce couldn't let it go. He saw the same pattern of denial that had cost lives in the desert. That night, while the others drank to forget, he walked the flight line with a lantern in hand. The drizzle was constant, coating the aircraft in a cold sheen. He stood beneath one of the mosquitoes, staring at the twin Merlin engines. The rainwater dripped from the cowlings in slow, rhythmic drops. He ran his fingers along the magneto covers, thin rubber, worn and cracked. He thought of the oil filters back in Tunisia, of how the simplest barrier had made all the difference. He went back to his workshop tent and started experimenting again. There were no spare parts, no sanctioned materials, just whatever he could scavenge. He found strips of treated canvas from an old barrage balloon, waxy and water-resistant, and combined them with fragments of aluminum shielding. Using a small blowtorch and a pair of pliers, he shaped a pair of makeshift drain skirts that would channel moisture away from the magneto housings instead of letting it pool on top. He used candle wax to seal the seams and wire to fasten them in place. It was crude, ugly even, but he'd learned that perfection was often the enemy of survival. When Corporal Nash, now also transferred to Italy, walked in and saw him at work, he shook his head with a weary smile. "You just can't leave things alone, can you?" Pierce grinned faintly without looking up. "The day I do, you'll know I'm dead." The first test came sooner than expected. A heavy storm rolled in 2 days later, grounding most operations. But one reconnaissance mission was deemed essential: enemy movements near Termoli, north along the Adriatic coast. Doyle, now a flight lieutenant himself, volunteered for it. "Using your new contraption again?" Doyle asked with a smirk as he strapped into the cockpit. Pierce patted the engine cowling. "If it leaks, I'll eat my wrench." The rain was relentless, hammering the tarmac as the mosquito roared to life. The engines held steady. Doyle lifted off into the gray sheet of rain and disappeared. For the next hour, Pierce stood by the radio post, listening to faint transmissions cutting through static. He heard Doyle's voice report over the Adriatic. Engine temperatures normal, flight steady. When the mosquito returned, wheels touching down with a hiss of wet gravel, the ground crew erupted into relieved laughter. The engines purred perfectly, not a single misfire. Word spread fast. Within days, mechanics across the base were fitting Pierce's makeshift rain skirts to their own aircraft. Within a week, a captain from Engineering Command arrived to inspect the modification. He called it clever, though his tone suggested it was clever in a dangerous, insubordinate way. Pierce knew that look well. Still, the deaths stopped. Pilots began trusting their engines again, flying longer, pushing deeper behind enemy lines. Pierce's quiet defiance had once again turned into survival for hundreds of men. But recognition remained elusive. A month later, a technical directive circulated through the Mediterranean Command. Revised magneto weatherproofing, Type D. It included every feature of Pierce's design: metal skirts, drainage channels, wax-sealed seams, without a single mention of his name. By then, Pierce didn't care about credit. He cared about sleep. He'd started waking in the middle of the night, hands clenched around imaginary wrenches, hearing phantom engines stalling in his dreams. The sound of mechanical failure had etched itself into his subconscious. When he wasn't working, he spent his evenings sitting near the perimeter fence, smoking in silence. The fields beyond were littered with old propellers and broken landing gear, rusting slowly in the rain. To most, they were just junk. To Pierce, they were tombstones. One night, Doyle found him there. "They're calling it the Pierce curse, you know," he said with a crooked grin. Pierce raised an eyebrow. "The what?" "Every time one of your fixes shows up, the death toll drops, but someone upstairs takes the credit. It's like your curse is saving people they'll never thank you for." Pierce laughed softly, the sound bitter but genuine. "I'll take that curse any day." In the months that followed, he kept working, often on his own dime. When supplies ran short, he traded cigarettes for scrap metal, coffee for spare tubing. He taught younger mechanics to improvise, to question manuals, to listen to machines the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. He told them, every sound means something. Ignore it long enough and it'll stop, but so will someone's heart. As 1944 wore on, the Allied advance intensified. Pierce followed his squadron north through the Italian hills, patching up aircraft under shell fire, improvising tools out of broken rifle stocks and bomb fragments. He became something of a legend among the ground crews, a man who could make anything run, no matter how hopeless. Then came a mission that would test everything he'd ever built. It was April 15th, 1944. The squadron was tasked with providing night cover for a convoy moving along the coast near Ancona. The weather was brutal. Wind howling, rain horizontal, visibility near zero. A dozen mosquitoes prepped for takeoff, engines howling in the storm. As the first plane rolled forward, a gust slammed across the field, and one of the chocks slipped. The aircraft veered, clipped a fuel truck, and erupted in a sheet of fire. The blast threw Pierce backwards, slamming him into a wall of mud and debris. When he came to, his ears were ringing, his hands bleeding. Flames clawed at the sky. 2 more planes were still on the line, fuel tanks half full, minutes away from igniting. Without thinking, Pierce ran toward them. He climbed onto one of the wings, tore open the fuel access hatch, and jammed his own wrench into the valve to stop the pressure buildup. The heat seared his arms, but the explosion didn't come. Others joined him, dragging hoses, shouting orders through the smoke. They managed to contain the fire before it reached the remaining planes. Afterward, as medics patched him up, Doyle crouched beside him and said, "You've got a death wish, you know that?" Pierce just smiled weakly. "No, just an allergy to preventable disasters." The war ended before Alan Pierce could ever see what his hands had truly accomplished. When the ceasefire came in 1945, he was in northern Italy, repairing a transmission on a half-wrecked Jeep that no one would ever drive again. The news came through the radio and broken transmissions. The Reich had surrendered. All around him, men cheered, shouted, wept. Pierce just sat down on the dirt, pulled off his oil-stained gloves, and stared at them for a long time. He didn't cry, didn't smile. He just breathed. For the first time in years, he let the air in without the smell of gasoline and burnt metal. He was demobilized 2 months later, given a transport ticket back to Bristol, and a letter of discharge that thanked him for his technical diligence under field conditions. No medals, no citations. Just words on thin paper that crinkled when he folded them into his jacket. His home looked smaller than he remembered. The workshop where his father had once built clock parts was silent, the dust thick on the benches. He picked up an old wrench and turned it in his hand, feeling the cold steel against his palm. The war had taken 6 years from him, but it had given him something else. An understanding of how fragile everything really was, and how much depended on the smallest, simplest ideas. He found work as a mechanic for a local bus company. He never talked about the war, except sometimes when a young apprentice complained about a design flaw or a jammed engine, and he'd smile faintly and say, "If it keeps breaking the same way, you're fixing the wrong thing." The others didn't know those words had saved lives. Decades later, in 1968, a retired RAF engineer named Thomas Ridley stumbled upon a stack of wartime field reports while helping catalog old maintenance logs for the Imperial War Museum. Among the papers was an unsigned technical note from 1943 describing a makeshift intake mesh to mitigate desert dust clogging. The handwriting was smudged, but the signature initials, AP, were still faintly visible. Ridley had served in North Africa himself. He remembered the stories, the whispers of a mechanic whose unapproved modification had stopped the crashes. He spent weeks tracing the name, writing letters, checking personnel lists. Finally, he found him. Sergeant Alan Pierce, retired, living quietly in Bristol. Ridley visited him that spring. He expected a hardened old man, bitter from years of anonymity. Instead, he found Pierce in his small garage, repairing a neighbor's lawnmower, hands still steady, eyes still kind. They spoke for hours. When Ridley mentioned the intake mesh, Pierce just laughed softly and said, "That old thing? I only meant to keep one engine alive long enough to bring Doyle home." Ridley tried to have the record corrected to add Pierce's name to the design archives. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time the process began, Pierce was already gone. He died quietly in 1971, a mild heart attack while tightening a valve on a city bus. They found him slumped against the tire, wrench still in hand, a faint half-smile frozen on his face. His funeral was small. A few neighbors, his sister, and an aging pilot who arrived unannounced, a man with white hair and a cane, who stood silently by the grave long after everyone else had left. The name on the stone read simply, Alan Pierce, 1912, 1971. Mechanic. But in the years that followed, his fingerprints were everywhere. Every aircraft that crossed a desert, every engine that flew through rain or dust without failing, bore the silent legacy of his stubbornness. His stupid idea had become doctrine, refined, replicated, and quietly absorbed into the bloodstream of aviation engineering. Generations of airmen survived because one exhausted mechanic refused to accept that a manual could know more than the battlefield. And though his story never made it into the official histories, it lived on in the way mechanics spoke to each other, in the shared belief that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't performed in cockpits or command tents, but in the dirt, under a wing, with a wrench and a conscience. There's a kind of courage that never asks for recognition, the kind that looks like stubbornness, sounds like muttering, and feels like grease under your fingernails. That was Alan Pierce's kind. He never sought glory, and glory never found him. But every time a pilot returned safely to base, every time an engine kept running through sand or storm, a small part of his defiance lived on. Proof that sometimes it takes one man's stupid idea to save an entire squadron from disaster. And if you listen carefully, somewhere between the roar of engines and the silence of history, you can still hear him whisper, "Fix the right thing."